Rise of Hawk, Part 5, Scene 8. Asha stood watching the street below her. At that height, from a neighbouring roof, the individual ochre cobbles below melded together into one flowing, spinning design that covered the entire intersection. She lifted the binoculars. The street was cordoned off by dark agency vehicles and police tape, framing Star Mall's northern entrance in an oblong semicircle. By her count, there were 2 teams of 8 black suit task force operatives and their high-ranking superior. The CO would be sitting in one of the black vans opposite the entrance with their radio, coordinating their search for and the capture of 2 traitors, Teres Mala and Nama Ree. On the agency's top 10 most wanted list, Teres and Nama were second equal underneath Hawk, much to Teres's amusement. Asha smirked. I bet Teres is having fun with all this attention. Dropping the binoculars, she glanced back over her left shoulder, across the top rooftops through a gap in the skyline. The agency tower building was angular, domineering, and covered in dark blue glass. Being the tallest skyscraper in Aram, it always seemed to her to be a bully kid glaring down at the other buildings. Another encrypted radio broadcast chattered in her earpiece on the agency radio channel, and she looked back at the Star Mall entrance below. Her left arm was strapped to her body and made completely unusable in an effort to ease her infuriatingly aching collarbone. She mentally grumbled. Ren wasn't able to heal bone as quickly as they could flesh, so she had to deal with the old-fashioned way, with time and patience. And she was quickly running out of the latter. She would have preferred to participate directly in their misdirection mission inside the mall. However, being a spotter was better than evacuating with the non-combatants and doing nothing at all. There were teams of rebels all around Aram, causing distractions at many different public places, with the hope of drawing people out of the tower. There were 2 teams at other malls, 1 team outside the cathedral, and another 2 up on the elevated motorways in front of the traffic cameras. At their best guess, all of the teams could save as many as 100 people, if they were lucky. There were also other smaller teams helping with the last escapes or attempting to minimize the damage, like Zach's team, who was shutting down the gas line to the tower. Her lips tightened. Unfortunately, the misdirection missions wouldn't be enough, not nearly enough, to stop even half of the potential innocent deaths from this explosion. There could still be as many as 500 people still in levels 8 through 12 when the explosion occurred. She sighed. At least they were trying, and those agents who were lured out would have their lives. Asha shook her head. She had to focus on those they were going to help, and not the hundreds of people they couldn't save, or she'd collapse from the grief. Over the garbled agency channel in her ear, she heard a radio buzz and 3 long channels of concentrated static. This was a signal from Tom in the tower that it was about to happen. Touching the earpiece, she buzzed the channel once to let him know that she'd received the message. She flicked stations to the rebel frequency and spoke into her headset. All stations evac. I repeat, all stations evac. Scene break. Star Mall. The Star Mall was considered to be one of the best malls in all of Orana. Nama felt it was more like a pretty rabbit warren, made of shining glass and steel. There weren't enough exits, and there were far too many angles from which a threat could come at him. But smashing cameras from wall sockets and breaking shop windows had improved his liking of the mall significantly in the last hour. Nama lifted the wooden bat and swung it at another camera on the wall. It shattered on impact, spreading chunks of dark plastic and glass across the polished wood floor. He laughed. This is fun. Told you, didn't I? Teres spoke over his shoulder as he too destroyed another camera. They were in a public corridor of the mall, near to the parking building entrance. Nama put the bat through the window of a men's clothing store and grabbed a black fedora hat from the display. He dropped it down onto his head and turned. Hey, Teres, what do you think? Further down the hall, Teres winked at Nama. Sexy. It suits you. but it's time we moved back downstairs. Nama nodded. As they turned towards the car parking entrance, he wondered if the other misdirection teams were having any luck throughout the city. All stations evac. I repeat, all stations evac. Asha's voice was completely icy cold in his earpiece. She was using her very serious commander voice, as Talon called it. You're single, aren't you, Asha? Tiris's replying tone was playful and flirting. Asha's laugh was almost a girlish giggle. I am if you grab some alcohol on your way out. Tiris laughed. I'll hold you to that. Nama smirked at his companion. Now, children, behave. As they ran down the second hall, Tiris grinned back over his shoulder. Never. Laughing, Nama followed him through a door and out into the car parking building, and down a concrete parking ramp to the next level. While he ran, Nama shoved the handle of the bat awkwardly into the belt of his jeans and brought out his handgun. On the next ramp, which brought them down to the ground floor level, they had to dodge around an abandoned car with its doors open and keys still in the ignition. One of the TFO teams must have forced the civilian owners out at gunpoint. Nama took note of its location in relation to the exits in case they needed to double back and find another escape route. He and Tiris approached the ground floor mall entrance, and he heard a distant boom that might be the tower. He gritted his teeth against a shot of dread and fear that wanted out of him. He swallowed and forced himself to refocus. There was nothing to be done now. All he could do was continue surviving. Tiris opened the mall entrance door for him, with his weapon up. Nama walked through and into a man in agency fatigues. They both flinched back. The fear was instant in the young man's grey-blue eyes, but he still lifted his automatic rifle into Nama's face. Hands up, the boy stammered. The radio on the TFO's bulletproof vest started to buzz away loudly. Nama guessed it was probably a voice telling this man he had to withdraw and get back to the tower immediately. Nama regripped his handgun and stared coldly at the boy. You have two choices, kid. You can continue this and die, or you can leave now and see if your family is okay. I won't shoot you unless you give me no choice. So just go. The TFO slowly lowered his rifle. He moved back until he got to a corner in the corridor, then he turned and ran. Nama stared at his receding figure and quietly hoped the kid's family and friends hadn't been in the tower. Nama, come on, we've got to go, yelled Tiris from behind him. He dropped his gun hand and turned the other way. The broom closet with Talon and Raha was down the hallway, and past it was an emergency fire exit that led out to the street and his van. They would pick up Asha and the Desert Kids, and then they would get out of the city. Scene 9. Close to the agency tower. Zack watched Liz close two big metal doors and pull a heavy chain through their handles. Beyond the doors and down a stairwell into the subterranean level in the sewers was a massive valve that they'd needed the three women's combined kinetic thrust to switch off. The gas supply was now cut to the tower as well as to the entire block around it. They had to just lock it all up again and they'd get back to the pickup point. Levi was out with another team, so it was just himself, Jai, Nick, and Liz on this mission. Four of them were down a short alley between buildings, which ended at a dirty brick wall and the sewer access. He glanced up above them. Broad, white stone apartments climbed high above their heads. Clothing and linen hung in the air in layers and attempted, perhaps futilely, to get dry in the dim space between buildings. A grey feline skulked around on a fire escape several stories above them. A window was open and bright yellow curtains fluttered in the breeze. Out on the same fire escape, a line of potted flowers filled what little space existed between the window pane and the fire escape ladder with a multitude of cheerful colours. Zack felt strangely nervous, scared even, and the feeling kept him distracted and unable to focus on any one thing at a time. Lock, called Liz from the door. His attention came back to where it should be, and Zack fetched the massive padlock from his pocket. He handed it to Jai, who passed it to Nick, and then to Liz. Thanks. Liz brushed back some of her ever-growing long blonde hair from her face and pulled the padlock into place through two heavy metal chain links. There was a click as the lock dropped into place, and Liz turned around to look at everyone. "All right, time to go. We've got to meet Nama in the van soon." She strode past Zack. The others walked after her, and Zack stepped in line last. He followed the trail of women out of the dim alley and into the street behind the tower. The road beyond was a one-way service lane behind the massive tower building. Zack had never seen the tower from that angle before. All of his visions and dreams had been from the plaza on the other side, which faced the main public entrance. He stopped walking in the middle of the lane and looked up. The tower building was so tall from that angle. It looked like a square obelisk of tinted glass and concrete that reached up and touched the sky with its very peak. Space and time rumbled around him, tumbling and twitching in every atom of the air. Reality shook with multiple static waves and ripples. His skin tingled so badly from the feedback that it felt as if he had insects crawling up his face. He held his breath. "This is it." "Zack," called someone from one side of him, but he didn't respond. He was moments away from the event around which his entire life had revolved for the last 10 years. The pulsing static flowed up the tower, causing shivers to eddy through his spine. The sensation peaked at the base of his skull and became almost painful. A boom sounded, and fire blew out of the glass building far above his head. The ground shook as the impact wave shimmered down to the street and out through the concrete. He sensed threads of terrified mental screams which were cut off abruptly. His mouth opened and he stared. Glass fell towards him, but in his horrified shock he was glued to the road. Massive shards shimmered in the air, and he knew that when those shards hit, they would kill him. But his body wouldn't move. "Zack!" a voice called out again. Something like big invisible hands grabbed him. He was pulled sideways so hard that what air was in his lungs was forced from him with a choked wheeze. As he flew, he heard the tinkling crashes of glass smashing on concrete behind him. When he landed roughly on the sidewalk next to the others, tears were running down his face. "By the old gods," he whimpered. "What have we done?" Liz knelt down next to him, and her smile was gentle. "Come on, Zack." She offered him a hand to help him stand. "We have to go now." Scene break. There was a deep sense of ill-ease inside Talon, and he stared out through the back of Nama's van and the road. On the horizon, surrounded in shorter skyscrapers, the agency tower building was on fire. Massive black clouds of smoke billowed out and filled the air around it. Numerous ambulance and fire service sirens blared as they rushed towards the tower. Talon swallowed. They'd done that. Together the rebels had done that. He wondered how many people would be dead by day's end. His father had always taught him that violence was a weak person's defence. He used to say that if you couldn't find a peaceful resolution to a situation, you weren't trying hard enough. His father had lived in a different world, a different Aram. He also had the police department to help hide him and his family, and in the end, all of his father's words had meant nothing, because the agency still found them, still murdered them and took Usher. Talon wondered if what they had done would make a difference at all in Arana, or if it would simply make things worse for the rebels. Had, in this case, his father been right? Was it a lazy person's action? Or had there really been no other choice but to strike back at the agency in such a horrific fashion? He swallowed and stared out through the glass at the burning tower, watching it as it got further and further away from them. Tay turned from the back door windows to look across Nama's crowded van. His sister sat with her back up against the front seats. He sensed over the muted shock of the desert kids that Usher was worried about him. He gave her a little smile. "I'm all right." He really wasn't, and the knowing smile on Usher's face suggested that she knew he wasn't either, but he didn't want to talk about it in the confines of the van. If they managed to get out of Aram before the agency shut down the city, they would have an 8-hour car journey on their hands. It would not be helpful to start the journey with any more melancholy than was absolutely necessary. He turned back to watch the burning, smoking silhouette of the tower grow smaller and smaller as they travelled away from the carnage. Scene 10. On the day of the 3010 bombing, there were 10 classrooms for under 5s, all located on level 8 and 9 of the tower building. Inexplicably, an hour before the explosion, all of the air conditioning units for each of those 10 classrooms failed simultaneously and could not be restarted by tech support. The classrooms became hotter and stuffier as the hour crept on. It eventually got so bad that every teacher pulled rank on their supervisors and evacuated their students to the empty teaching labs on level 20. The very last class to evacuate upstairs left 14 minutes before the explosion ripped through levels 12, 11, 10, 9 and 8. Because the servers were located on level 11, no one ever discovered the virus written by one Rahan Arya and planted on the agency system by his cousin Toma Arya. Officially, it was forever thought of as an extremely fortunate act of divinity. Toma Arya, who had been the personal assistant for an undisclosed high-ranking agent, also became one of the most public heroes of the day. Tom, being a fairly low-rated clairsentient, had sensed fire was coming and was cutting off all of the locks on the old fire escape doors at the time of the explosion. The open fire doors enabled those survivors of the initial explosion to escape the resulting flames that spread through some of the upper levels of the tower building afterwards. His actions saved approximately 2,000 adults and children from dying that day, with those who were lost in the initial explosion. Outside, as emergency crews were putting out the fires and evacuating and treating the survivors, a number of those agents evacuated to the street went missing. They drifted off one by one from a crowd of their fellow agents and disappeared. In small groups, those ex-agents, all covered in soot and dust from the explosion, met at a large open access point in the storm drains. A number of rebels welcomed them and directed them all to go down into the drains, where together they made their way through an ancient underground network towards the ocean. Ironically, their path through the sewers also happened to be the same journey the survivors of the Reformation massacre followed when they evacuated the city just over 1,000 years before. The newly escaped rebels were taken north up the coast on an illegal trawler to the small mountain city of Shada. All those missing in the bombing, including the people who escaped in the agency that day, were declared killed in the explosion or the fire, and were never pursued by the agency. Further out, near the edge of Aram city limits, Nama drove his little white van and the remaining rebels of his cell out of the city. 5 minutes after they passed through the boundary line, the temporary head of the agency ordered the city to be completely blocked off from the rest of Arana. The new head started the search to find the rebels responsible for the horrific bombing that killed almost 300 people, including all but one of the original Azera Council. But to no avail. In the 5 years following the bombing, no rebels directly responsible for the bombing were ever found. The 3010 Aram Agency tower bombing became the kind of event where everyone knows where they were and what they were doing when it happened. Scene 11. Outskirts of the city of Pira, 8 hours drive southwest of Aram. Talon sat out on the balcony of an old farmstead and watched the sunset over the scrubby, abandoned fields. There was something inherently peaceful in the sound of the wind in that place, and he needed that feeling to seep into his body and ease the pain inside him. The farmstead had been stocked up with food and other supplies by one of the Pira rebel cells a few days earlier, so that at least they could stay there for a while. David had said the agency would try to hunt down every rebel after the bombing, so each cell had to hide, no matter where they were in Arana, until the grief-soaked search ceased. Talon swallowed and wiped at his nose. The last count on the radio for the bombing had been over 200 dead. It was horrific. He wasn't sure what to do with the feeling inside him, or if he'd ever feel differently in the future. It felt like a terrible mistake that he should have somehow tried harder to prevent. The front door opened and he looked back to see his sister Asha standing in the balcony. She approached and passed him a mug of hot chocolate. Her smile was sympathetic. She knew how he felt about all of this, probably even better than Nama. He took a sip and leaned sideways on the balcony rail. I don't know if what we've done was worth it. One corner of her mouth lifted just like David, but her eyes were gentle, not mocking. Talon, I know it seems awful right now, and it really is. I'm upset and grieving over what we did too. But trust me when I say that it was worth it. By doing this thing, the rebels have helped to save far more lives than we took. Talon frowned at her. How is that possible? Her dark blue eyes were sad, and she touched his arm. Just trust me, Talon. Can you do that? He stared at her for a moment, fighting with his own childlike need to understand, and his instinctive sense of absolute faith in her. His trust won the argument, and he smiled. Of course I trust you. Good. She dropped her hand from his arm. It was then he sensed that she was worried about something. Something else. Is something wrong? She sighed and shook her head. I haven't heard from David yet. You expected to? There were tears in her eyes when she glanced up at him. The shock of understanding pushed the air from his lungs. Was he the bomber? I don't know. She shook her head. Last we talked, he hadn't decided. What are the rebels going to do without him? I have no idea. The rushing wind filled the quiet that descended between them. They stood side by side on the balcony, watching the sunset. Bright oranges and yellows played in long wifts of cloud. As the sun eased out of sight, the orange shifted into red and eventually purple. Stars flickered on and filled the entire darkening sky with little points of light. The sun sank away and the sky became dark. Stars expanded into their flickering rainbow mass of nebula above them. When it was dark, as it was going to get on a clear two-moon night, Talon sensed the approach of an unknown mind. He felt the telepathic equivalent of a knock on the door. Asha? Talon touched his sister's shoulder and led her into the conversation. Who are you? He frowned. It doesn't matter who I am, Talon Khan, said a woman's voice. Hawk is asking for transport. We're trapped in Aram and we need to get out of the city before the agency finds us. The other mind was calling from far beyond the limits of his senses. Whoever she was a very powerful telepath. Talon frowned. I don't know you. How can I know for certain that you're from Hawk? There was a mental sigh. Hold on. The woman kept a touch on his mind, but he sensed that she stepped back for a moment. Talon felt Nama's mental energy join the conversation just as the woman returned. He wants to know if Asha's there. I'm here. Who are you? Another sigh came from the woman, and Talon sensed that she was extremely tired. It doesn't matter who I am. The pertinent point is that Hawk needs someone to come back for us. Asha's mental voice was firm and emotionless. Despite the anticipation, Talon could sense it empathically. I'm not ordering anyone to go anywhere until you prove that your message is from Hawk himself. There was another long pause. He says to tell Nalana that her skin is saved. Nama pulled away from their connection and Talon waited for him to pass on the message to Nalana. A squeal emitted from inside the farmstead, and the front door banged open. Nalana ran towards them with a massive grin on her face. It's him, he's alive. All right, Asha said, laughing. How many of you are there? 8 children, 5 adults. Nama? Front door opened. Nama was wearing his new black fedora hat and mirror-shaped glasses. He grinned at them. I'll be there by morning. Where does he want me to meet? The end.